Hey, and welcome back to Podcraft, the show all about podcasting. I'm Colin Gray from thepodcasthost.com, joined by Matthew, as always. How are you getting on this week, Matthew?
Yeah, good, Colin. Tell the listener what you were just telling me there about the intro.
The intro, the golden rule around podcasting, always talk to one person, and I've suddenly kind of realised that I give out that advice week in, week out to hundreds of people, and I incessantly decide instead to start all of our podcasts with the words, "Hey folks." So
but it's iconic. You can't change it. You also said welcome back. I mean, I could argue that what if it's the listener's first turn with Podcraft? You've welcomed them back. So
I think that maybe hopefully makes it feel like, even if they are brand new, we still consider them a regular, a local, a loyal listener anyway. So they're welcome in, welcome back, even if you've never been before.
We're the cozy pub of podcasts.
That's it. Absolutely.
Take a seat by the fire.
That's it. And in that seat by the fire, this week around, you'll learn such things as the results of our podcast discovery survey. Actually, that's going to be really interesting, isn't it, Matthew? Digging into how people actually discover podcasts, how they find them. So we've got loads of lessons in there actually around how people find new shows, which really helps you figure out, how to get more listeners listening to yours. Then we've got a review. Was this one by yourself, Matthew, or was it somebody else in the team with the iVlogger?
No, it was me. Imagine that. Actually did some work.
I mean, it's unusual, but yeah. So we've got a wee review of the iVlogger Pro as well, which is a great wee setup actually, tripod and mount for your phone to record a video podcast with loads of lighting and audio options too. We've got a wee update to our best podcast directories article actually, a few updates to the kinds of directories you should be submitting to these days. So we'll dig into that a little bit. And then finally, a couple of articles to mention from other outlets, a couple of great ones, and one we've got a wee argument with. Matthew, is that too strong?
Not in this cozy pub, no. We'll just we'll sit them down and have a good chat by the fire.
Indeed. And it'll get more and more argumentative and loud the more beers we have in this pub.
Yeah, until the bouncers start to shift at 8:30 and then it all kicks off.
And then we're out.
So.
Great stuff. All right, let's dig into it. So, discoverability survey. I mean, this is your baby, Matthew. You've done a great job getting this done this year. Well, Katie as well, to be fair, on our team. So yeah, thanks to both of you for doing that. So where do you want to take us with this? What's a good place to start? What do we learn?
Yeah, so like you're saying this, I'm just so glad to get this out at last. It feels like a long time coming, but it's been worth all the background work on it, and hopefully it'll be well received and really useful to people. As the listener, if you're a recording listener, which I would assume you are, has known, we really tried to incentivise podcasters to share this with their own audience there. We were really keen, as much as we appreciated people who were podcasters answering this from a listener perspective. It was really great to hear specifically from those folks out there that are listeners and they don't have any of that knowledge about how the sausage is made. So it was really cool to get. It was 56% of folks were pure listeners, 25% were experienced podcasters who also listen to other shows, and 19% were listeners first, but also aspiring or early stage podcasters. So that's a decent spread there, Colin, isn't it? I mean, one of the interesting things was I was going to split out the data from the listeners only and compare it with the folks who had podcasted. There was absolutely nothing in there that jumped that was different, so it wasn't worth doing. I said in the report it would just make it 3 times longer than it needed to be. So
with the same data.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it, isn't it? So many podcasters were listeners first. So I don't know if there is any difference really. Seems to me not much point splitting out. So that's cool. Yeah. All right. So what about the data then? First question I see on your report here is discovering new podcasts easy. This is something that people moan about a lot in podcasting, isn't it? We have a discoverability problem, Matthew. I don't know if you heard that.
Yeah. Aye. The question was, do you find it easy to discover new podcasts that speak to your interests? 67% said yes, they do. 27% said no, they didn't, and 6% were kind of unsure. Was this at all surprising to you anywhere, Colin?
Nah, not really. I mean, I think that's been solved. I think people that are into podcasting know where to look for new shows. I think the only difficulty we have really these days is the deeper discoverability. So it's quite easy to find a podcast that's about the topic that you're into. You just search for mountain biking or sewing or, surfing, whatever it is. You find a podcast on that topic. The discoverability issue is actually the depth of content we have in our back catalogues and actually helping people surface that stuff, to find those. Some apps do list episodes based on keywords as well, but it's nowhere near the kind of algorithmic discoverability that you get when you're watching YouTube or Instagram or whatever, where profiles that you don't necessarily follow can show up because they know that if you like this, you like that. So that's the thing still to solve. But yeah, finding actual shows around your topic, easy enough. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all.
On to the next one then. Where do people find new podcasts? So the question here was, you want to find a new podcast. What do you do first? So what sort of data are we seeing there, Colin?
Yeah, so where do you find a new podcast? People look like they are actually just using the apps, like I said. So 50% of people actually just use their podcasting apps. They'll open up Apple Podcasts, they'll open up Pocket Casts and just search in a topic. I wonder, what's your thoughts in terms of like whether they use the search or whether they use the browse function as well? Was that something you digged into on this survey?
Yeah, we get into that a bit further on, yeah. So yeah, I mean, opening up the podcast app is the first kind of step for a lot of people, well, half of people, but what they do when they get there, we'll find out a bit more about that shortly.
Cool. Yeah, so second place, 13%, they listen out for recommendations on the podcast they already enjoy. So I think that's a good lesson for podcasters, isn't it?
I thought that was a bit funny though, because like I'm in the market for a new show. It's like, it's not guaranteed that obviously there will at some point, but it's not guaranteed anyone's going to mention another podcast anytime soon. So that's a real long game, that one. So
Yeah, to actually search out for it. I suppose maybe it's more indicating that they have heard a trailer or mention or whatever. Yeah, but that's something I talk about a fair bit, like trying to, it's a great growth tactic. Just work with other podcasters, find people in your niche. Nobody listens to just one show on a particular topic. So yeah, definitely worth doing that. And then the next one, 12%, is just word of mouth, isn't it? So directly asking someone I know who likes the same stuff. So not too much of a surprise there. Word of mouth, was that I feel like that was higher up in a previous version of this survey. Is that right, Matthew?
We probably dug into that at some point again, because we're running down in a linear manner. But yeah, I think you're right. The 2021 word of mouth was potentially a bit higher.
I'm jumping ahead, yeah. So the next one down, 11%. So seemingly not a massive amount, 10%, 1 in 10 people, but actually it's really beneficial for other reasons too, which is use a search engine. So using Google, using Bing, using whatever. If you play that game, you start writing more text-based material to get your podcast out there, especially for the episodes. We talked about that discoverability issue around episodes, but you can create great episode pages titled by the question that episode tackles. And then suddenly you're being found by these 10% people that use a search engine to find new podcasts, but also the zillions of other people that are not necessarily looking for a podcast, but they're looking for an answer to this question anyway. So I think that's a really important one too. It's obviously something that real podcast listeners use, as shown by here, but actually it's a great way to gather in listeners from elsewhere, find people that are not necessarily looking for a podcast and surfacing the fact that you are the one that can answer this for them.
10% said ask on social media or in an online community as well. So that's a not an insignificant number, I guess.
For sure.
Down there at 1%, search on YouTube. Did that surprise you?
How low the YouTube one was?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's growing, obviously, but it's still not a huge place to search for podcasts, is it? It's where you search for video. And I know podcasts are growing on YouTube, and maybe it will be a place people search more in future, but for now, no. It's a good place to be, but
yeah, I think if you're on YouTube, I'm not speaking for everyone here, obviously, but you're generally searching for maybe short form content rather than, let me just find a an hour-long podcast episode. Again, there will be exceptions there, but...
Yeah, I think that trend is changing a fair bit. There's a lot more YouTube channels that do much more long-form stuff, but it's not really a podcasting type format. It's more kind of produced, it's more edited, it's more like day in the life vlog type stuff. So the long form, but yeah, I'm saying that, but that's just the stuff that shows up in my feed. YouTube is just an infinite variety of all sorts of content. So, But yeah, still interesting to see only 1% just now. Right. Next one. So think about the last podcast you listened to. How did you initially discover it? So this was an attempt to make it kind of more practical, wasn't it? Dig into really, what was the last podcast you listened to? How did you discover it? What do we see there, Matthew?
Yeah, like you're saying there, this is, people tell you what they do, but sometimes when you ask them what they've actually done, it's a slightly different matter. So this was like... I think it's a good thing that this was such a broad spread because it shows that there's so many different ways to be discovered. So top but not by much was 19%, and that was browsing a podcast app directory or chart. Again, it shows that a lot of people are taking to these apps to look for podcasts, which makes a lot of sense. Up there at 16%. In second place, social media post by the podcast creator, going against everything I say, Colin. If you just post about your show on social media, nobody cares. This is shown otherwise, isn't it? So yeah, showing that it does work. It still does work. Many people do it, so it does actually, produce results for those people. But yeah, still practical, targeted, well-made promos for your podcast and social are a good method. Yeah. What about next? We've got 14%. I heard about it on another podcast, reviewed or mentioned. So that was going back to what we mentioned a little earlier. So maybe hopefully getting collaborations with other podcasters and getting your show mentioned on them. And then we've got a tie at 13% on it was recommended to me by somebody offline or somebody online. So essentially, personal recommendations. So that goes back to what you were saying there about word of mouth, because you look at that 26% really would put that top of the list as word of mouth. So
just split between offline and online. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And a good one here, 6%, next one down. The creator was interviewed on another podcast. So showing that, 6%, not a huge number, but still a non-insignificant number of people listening to a show because they heard you on another interview. So showing that still does work to grow your audience. If you can get out there, collaborate with other podcasters, contribute some great content to their shows, Matthew?
Yeah, definitely. And then there's the old search engines just underneath as well at 5.5%. Google, Bing, Ask Jeeves. Ask Jeeves never got a mention. He was mentioned on the 1998 survey that we did.
Yeah. I was trying to remember the name of the old, what was it? Acaster, the host came to mind there, but it wasn't that. Can't remember. Lycos? Was that it? Can't remember.
Anyway. I think so, yeah.
And then last one we've got here, 3%, is through an algorithm. So this digs into actually the recommended or next up features within podcast apps. Only 3% claim that they have listened to a show that way. Does that tally with your experience, Matthew? I think that does tally with mine, as in I very rarely have subscribed to a show by finding it in those little recommended spaces in Pocket Casts that I use more often than not. Is that the same with you?
Yeah, I can't say I've never done it. In the Apple Podcasts app, when I was using that, I think I found a couple of podcasts this way. And it's worth clarifying, like, this isn't 3% saying they've never done that. This was them purely talking about, like, the last show they listened to. So it's a snapshot in time kind of thing. But yeah, it shows that it's certainly not as popular as some of these other ways.
Yeah. Saying that, next one up is related to exactly this. So maybe that's going to belie that a little bit. So next question was, if you use your preferred podcast app to find a show, how do you search? So this is exactly that question. So top by miles though, 70% of people who are using their podcast app are typing a topic into the search bar. So a couple of things here, isn't it? Like, first of all, this is all about podcast SEO. This is where your title comes into play so heavily. It's where your artwork comes into play so heavily. Thinking about, how you include those keywords that tells people what your podcast is about, both in the title and in the description to an extent. Title most important by miles, but the artwork too, making sure that when they find it, the artwork really stands out and reiterates really what that show is about. So is this kind of driving home that idea, Matthew, that, smart, funny podcast names can actually hurt you rather than help you. And actually the kind of, the Ronseal does what it says in the tin approach can be much more effective.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I know that, as we see more advanced AI style transcription search, maybe this will become less important, but then again, maybe not. Maybe still having those very prescriptive titles is always going to be the best approach, because they'll still stand out. Even if it's suggesting an episode to you and it's not that clearly titled, you're probably going to pick the clearest title over it, aren't you? So
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
Podcasters should still pay attention to this.
Yeah. Podcast SEO applies to episodes as well, though, doesn't it? Like, this is the same way. If somebody types in a topic, a question, a problem into the search bar at the top, it'll show the podcasts that relate to that first, but then it often shows episodes depending on what app you're using. So episode titles, again, so important, as in the big mistake that people often make is put the name of the interviewee first, or, season 12, episode 2, Brian something or other, and that's it. That's all you see. And that's useless for this kind of search. Whereas if you've got the problem, the solution, the question, a real clear indication of value right at the top of that episode title, that's exactly where this can show up. And 70% of people search in that way. This is like really key to get yourself found, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a frustration for me because I use Overcast, and that's a great podcast listening app, but it doesn't have topic search.
Really?
You have to find a podcast and then you could search its episodes, but you can't. I've not found a way just to search like its complete directory for episodes. So I have to do my search in an Apple Podcast and then go back and find the podcast in Overcast. I literally did that yesterday. Like, a games came out that I'm really interested in, so I typed the name of the game and the game designer in Apple Podcasts, and I got like 4 or 5 episodes that he was on. So
yeah. But Overcast just doesn't allow that. It'll only search by the name of the podcast.
If you can do it in Overcast, I've never been able to find a way to achieve it. So
all right. What does this data tell us? Other ways people find their shows within podcast apps with you? Yeah.
So 21.5% are browsing the categories. So again, that makes a lot of sense. And I think one thing about browsing categories is, again, there might be exceptions to this, but you're generally likely to see podcasts that have been going for a wee while and have a bank of episodes to be featured in those categories. Again, I'm not saying there won't be exceptions here, but you might find a great podcast episode somewhere, but maybe it's literally the only episode that show's got. Whereas if you're browsing the categories, you'll maybe see, this is a living, breathing show. So
the more established ones, potentially. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, we're talking about discoverability being a little bit broken for podcasting potential. This is one of the areas where it is, isn't it? It's like so fragmented amongst all the different apps. That's the trouble. Like, it totally depends. So you're saying Overcast is really bad for that issue. Pocket Cast, certainly. I've never really used the categories in it because I'm not sure I've ever found it that useful. iTunes. Apple Podcasts was always famously reasonably good for this, wasn't it? Which was why the whole new and noteworthy and what's hot sections were always talked about so much, weren't they? Because they did actually... Well, no one knew exactly how they worked. It was always a little bit grey area. It was always a little bit, the kind of the suspicion was that it was around velocity of follows. That was one of the biggest ones. So if you had, 7 people subscribed to you today and 6 yesterday and 5 the day before, then that's kind of an increasing velocity of follows. So you're more likely to get into new noteworthy and it'll show up. And so Apple Podcasts would tend to be quite good actually for finding those living, breathing shows, like you say, those shows that are really active, those shows that are on the increase, on the incline, as opposed to, dying or just inactive as well. So that's one thing I'd love to see more of, somehow brought together into one place, into one app, or in some place at least. Yeah.
A couple of small ones there. See what the app's algorithm recommends at 6%, and 2.5% browse through the chart or featured sections.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So what we've got next, Matthew? We've got what attracts podcast fans to hit play on a new show they discover. So this is something really key to us as podcasters, isn't it? What do we have to do to make sure if somebody finds your show, they're actually going to hit that play button? So what do we see here, Matthew?
Yeah, just like you're saying there, I kind of re-emphasised throughout this report that podcast discovery is a journey rather than an event. It's not this binary like, I've not discovered the show, now I've discovered it, job done. Like, you've still got work to do. Maybe somebody's sitting there looking at their app, they've got your show, they've still to press play. So we basically gave the respondents a bunch of options of things that they would be considering and looking at, and just asked them to put them in order from most important to them to least important. So we'll start with the least. The way down at the bottom was that the podcast had a video component. Second bottom was that they knew what the host looks like. The next one was social media presence. The fact that they'd maybe heard of the presenter before, and then the podcast's name. So that was the 5 that were the least important. I guess, like Colin, that maybe the only surprising one there might be the podcast name, but I suppose if that's done its job already and I'm finding it, it's now moving on to the next stage.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It must be something around that, because yeah, maybe that's them saying, you're right. So we've discovered it already. We've found it. The podcast name has probably led us to it. But now actually, we don't, the name itself, like how good the name is not going to make a difference to whether I listen or not. So we're moving on to something else. We're moving on to deeper evidence now to determine whether we're going to actually play this thing. Yeah. Because you see, yeah, so now we go to like number 2 there. Episode titles. That's the next thing, isn't it? Like, the name gets you into looking at the show, but then I look at the episode titles to decide whether I'm really going to listen. And that's second most important out of the whole thing. And description, number 1. Description most important out of everything. Do you find that surprising, Matthew?
I do. And this is exactly the data we got back in 2020 when we ran the survey. So there's obviously something in it.
Yeah,
but I do personally find it interesting that is like the most.
Yeah, because I rarely look at the description, I'll be honest. Like, I think I tend to make a decision on, I'll find it by the name, of course, artwork, which we'll come to in a second, that does come in here as well, and then episode titles. I think one of the most important for me, I want to know what topics they actually talk. Maybe this is like cynical experience of having listened to podcasts for nearly 20 years now. The fact that I know that the description and the name don't often reflect actually what goes into the show itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I remember, when we did this report 4 or 5 years ago, and I do remember saying to folks that it's a funny thing, because when you write your description as a podcaster, for a lot of folks, they've only written the description because they're setting up their show and they're hosting, and they've suddenly got this blank box and they just write something in, and it's always just been their description. So
that's totally
funny.
Yeah. You write your description when you're setting it up, and then 2 years later, you haven't changed it in any way, and it completely doesn't reflect what your podcast is about these days. So, so worth going back, having a look at your description right now and seeing, like, does this reflect the way I am now? Does it reflect topics that I'm talking about? Even if you haven't changed tack that much, almost certainly you've figured out a bit more about your audience, more about the problems they have, about the solutions they're looking for, about the language they use, about the format, like how you really deliver this show. So there'll be so much there that can go into improving that description to really make it really pop when somebody reads it. And going by this data, we know now that description is actually something that people really pay attention to. So there must be so many shows out there losing potential listeners because of an out-of-date description.
So you'd said 2 there's episode titles. What we got? 3, 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah. So number 1, description. 2, episode titles. And number 3 is release frequency. Let's come back to that. I'll go through the 6 first. Release frequency, number 3. Number 4, ratings and reviews. Number 5, guest recognition. That surprises me a little bit. And 6 is artwork. So number 6 is artwork. What about them then, Matthew? What does that does that tally with yourself?
Release frequency is, I'm not saying I wouldn't find a podcast that's obviously stopped putting out episodes and it's evergreen and it's still interesting to me and I might binge it, but if they were still putting out regular episodes, I think that would put another little drop in the bucket that would maybe sway me to getting involved. What about yourself?
Yeah, same. It's not about how often or even how regular necessarily. It's just seeing that it's active, essentially. So I don't care if it's one every week on the dot, like a train turning up. It's as long as there's been like 2 or 3 in the last month, and then 2 or 3 in the month before that, and then 2. You know what I mean? Like it can be every couple of weeks. It can be 1 week and then 3 weeks, and then 1 week and then 2 weeks. I don't care as long as it looks active. Essentially, does that make sense?
Yeah. I can't tell if I've went deaf in one ear or if my headphones died. Because it's one of the two. No, I don't think I'm deaf in one ear.
You sound fine, so I think it's not affecting your audio.
Yeah, it just happened when you were talking there, so I am now deaf in one ear through my headphones.
I'm only speaking out of one side of my mouth. That's the
thing. So ratings and reviews, that's an interesting one because you don't find them on loads of platforms, do you? So
yeah, you're right. That probably reflects. Well, I mean, I suppose the two most popular, isn't it? Spotify and Apple right now. Apple certainly have them. They're the traditional rating and review place. And Spotify have ratings now, don't they? Do you know?
That's right. Yeah, they've got ratings.
Yeah. So, I mean, so that means, what are they on now? That's like 70% of listens, isn't it? It's like 30 plus for both of them, I think, in most apps or most hosting stats. So yeah, 70+% of people should be able to see them, I guess. But yeah, that's an obvious one, isn't it? So yeah, it is still worth asking for those every now and again. I mean, it's not the best call to action in the world, but still worth trying to canvass them a little bit, isn't it? Maybe every now and again. I quite like it actually as an irregular campaign, like once every couple of months, maybe once every 3 months, once a quarter. That would make sense. Maybe do a little campaign over 2 or 3 episodes just to try and get some new reviews in, new ratings, that kind of thing. I quite like that as a strategy.
Guest recognition, 5th. Just to clarify, that means that they'd heard of the guest rather than they would physically recognise the guest in the street. So I take it that doesn't align with your habits, Colin.
Nah, not really. I really don't care who the guests are. It's about the content, isn't it? Do you know? There is a bit of context to there, though. That's because most of the podcasts I listen to are kind of learning podcasts, or they're not necessarily entertainment. Whereas there is one show, to be fair, I do exactly this. So Smartless, you ever listen to Smartless at all? No, it's 3 famous dudes. I'm not going to remember their names. I can't remember at all. Jason Bateman is one of them, and they just interview famous people basically. And that is the one show, because it is like famous people interviewing famous people. I only listen to episodes which have somebody on it that I know and I kind of want to hear from. And it's the same with a few other shows out there, the kind of very, very big ones that interview really big people. It'll only be I'll dig in when it's somebody that I really want to hear from. But I just don't think it'd affect which shows I'd subscribe to for a normal type of podcast that's not getting famous folk on, like proper celebrities. I don't think it makes the slightest bit of difference.
Last one, well, not last one, but in 6th place, last of the good ones, artwork. Podcast artwork. So
yeah, I mean, artwork is so important for podcasts, isn't it? I think but this is partly for the front end. It's for the discovery in the first place, as in you're showing up in the search results. You've searched a topic. Artwork is going to be one of those quite important parts that makes people click on it and dig into it a little bit more. So it's probably before what makes you hit play part. But still, I think there's something around the professionalism. It shows the polish, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't need to be super fancy, but it just needs to be quite clean and reflect what the show's about. But yeah, I suppose it does. I think this is maybe the same as the podcast name thing, as in people don't really, it doesn't, once you're in and looking at a show, it doesn't affect whether you hit play or not. It's more the front end, finding you in the first place. Yeah.
And the thing is here, it's all stacking conditions in your favour, isn't it? It's not to say that like any one of these is going to make or break your podcast, but if you just pay attention to them all as best you can, give yourself the best chance of folks hitting play when they find you.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, this is a cool one. I like this. Episode length. Is this important to podcast discovery? So this is about what people prefer in terms of episode length. So the question was, what's your preference when it comes to podcast episode length? So 53% of people said they prefer if episodes are within the 15 to 60 minute range. 15 to 60 minute, that is. Then we have 32%, they don't care. They don't have an episode length preference at all. 15% prefer if the episodes are longer. That's over an hour. And a massive 0% prefer if the episodes are shorter, less than 15 minutes. So 0% of people prefer it when episodes are shorter. What do you think of those results, Matthew?
Yeah, definitely not surprising to me, but I like it.
Yeah.
And again, I've stressed in the report that that's not to say you won't find loads of examples of really popular short shows of less than 15 minutes. It just shows that when folk are in the market for getting into a new podcast, that doesn't seem to be what they're looking for. And, you know, like you were saying on a recent episode, Colin, I know you kind of like that sort of 45-minute sweet spot for an episode. Yeah. So that fits with 53% of folks here. And it's really cool that like 15% of folks are literally, they're like, I'm up for an hour or more of this. So it's really cool.
I think it's a great validation of what really podcasts are all about, which is deeper content, more intimate personal content, long form content that takes a while to, you know, get that deep and get that intimate and build that personality. And there's no rush. It's a conversation that you can really get into things. And there's no worry about attention spans and having to hook people. I mean, all this stuff does help. But, you know, you don't have to stress too much about that, like making the first 5 minutes the most exciting ever and all these engagement tactics and all that kind of stuff, because it's a conversation. It's two real people actually having a chat with each other. So I think it's great. I think it shows really the power of podcasting and why people listen to podcasts and why we're going to argue with this article later on in this episode about a complete and utter shift to video as well, because I think audio-only podcasts will always have a place when people are looking for thoughtful, long-form conversations to entertain them, to learn from, to inspire them. And I think, the short one's funny, actually, the 0% there. I think you're right. Nobody goes into a podcast app saying, I only want to listen to a show less than 15 minutes. When they do listen to those popular sub 15-minute ones, it's because they have a really particular hook, isn't it? Like the news shows, the daily news shows that do really well. It's because, I've discovered a news show and it's only 5 minutes a day. And that's actually quite good in that context. But it's not exactly someone you go looking for necessarily, unless there's a really specific context like that. Right. Back catalogue, we dig into that?
Yeah, this is a funny one because I was so like, you know how when you've been working on like a big piece of content like this for a while, you get very like desensitized to it and then you publish it and you just notice something afterwards. Yeah. And I looked through this morning because I knew we were recording. And I thought when I got to this, I thought to myself, I've not even mentioned this in the 3 key takeaways. And on hindsight, now that I'm reading it, to me, this is potentially the biggest key takeaway. Right. If you'll allow me to explain, which I'm sure you will. So certainly not. We'll move on now. So why I think this is potentially the most important takeaway, even though I've not included it in my key takeaways, is that the fact that only 3%, specifically say that they don't listen to back catalogues. Like, that's great news for podcasters, isn't it? Because it's a really good incentive to keep publishing new content, because that content, it's not just like your episode's out there and then it vanishes. Like, it's there for good. So like if you have 50 hour-long episodes, each time you find a new listener, that's potentially like 50 hours they'll spend with you and your content and all your CTAs, like 50 call to actions. Like, that's really powerful for that cumulative growth, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so much. It's it's the way that people really buy in, isn't it? It's the way you get hooked in and fall down that rabbit hole of content and go from being a who's this guy or girl to like, oh, this is my favorite content creator ever, and being like so into their stuff and telling everyone else about it. And that spurs the word of mouth, all that kind of stuff, because you listen to one episode and you're like, that was really good. And then you look back and you go, wow, that's a good topic. You listen to that and that was brilliant. And then you keep going and then you end up spending a whole week listening to 10 hours of their stuff and you're in. So it's, yeah, you're right. It's a big takeaway showing that other people are like that, because certainly I'm like that. Yeah, it doesn't, I mean, they're saying half of the people say it doesn't affect their decision to listen necessarily, but that's 30% of people that prefer a podcast to have a big back catalogue of episodes. So 30% of people that show that they're gonna like put weight on that and listen to a show they're more likely to listen because they see that this thing has, a provenance of content. It's got this big kind of weight of stuff behind it that shows that you've done your work and you've got good at it and you're committed.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like I say, it's a great incentive to keep publishing episodes. Some folks will give up early before they've kind of hit that critical mass, that back catalogue, and once you maybe get that 25 to 30 episodes, you just get that momentum without even having to really do much. So
yeah, totally, absolutely, yeah. Right. How long will potential listeners give you to hook them? So this kind of almost going back on what I just said there. But actually it kind of doesn't. Shows that podcasters do give people a lot longer, will give you a lot longer to hook them, to bring them in than your average, blog or YouTube episode or whatever. So we had this year, so we'll go back into the last year's one as well, because this has changed. So this year, 2024, 40% of people will give a show up to 15 minutes to hook them in. So that's a quarter of an hour you have to hook them in. Like, what do you think the comparison there is to YouTube or a blog, Matthew?
Well, when you look at any YouTube-related advice for creators, they talk about seconds, don't they? Yeah. Or certainly minutes, and it's lower minutes, like it's 1 minute, and that I think that would be very generous on a video. So
there's an enormous drop off in the first minute. Like you're right, in seconds, dozens of seconds, if not single seconds. It's terrible. So 15 minutes for nearly half of people, like 40% of people give you 15 minutes is amazing. And that's up from 2020 as well. So 2020, that was only 29% actually gave you up to 15 minutes. So nearly 30% in 2020 and 40% in 2024. So actually people who listen to podcasts are willing to give them more time now to hook you in, which is amazing. What about one full episode, Matthew?
Yeah, that went up, didn't it? So 23% would give you a full episode in 2020. Now it's 29%. So again, folks getting more patient.
So up from roughly a quarter to roughly a third there. That's a big increase, like 6% increase there. We'll give you a whole episode to hook them in. And then 5 minutes or less, we have, that's dropping obviously, so 17% this year. So only 17% will give you 5 minutes or less. 10% will give you 2 full episodes, 11 really, but 2 full episodes. And then you've got 3% of people will give you 3 to 5. That seems generous, I'll be honest.
Yeah, it's very, imagine you're like, this isn't really going well, but until I've heard that 5th episode.
Yeah. Totally. That's no good. That's down from last year. So yeah, all of the stats have moved towards that 15-minute and 1 full episode. Both of them have increased on last year by a fair bit, which is really cool. Well, even 2 full episodes has increased by 1%, to be fair. So yeah, really promising, really heartening to see that podcast listeners are up for giving us some time, are up for getting into conversations, are up for higher attention spans and really keeping that going.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out too that like 2% of folks in 2020 would only give you 1 minute or less, and 0% would do that this year. So
yeah, that's cool.
Good old podcast listeners.
Indeed. the discerning content consumers, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. How important is audio quality to podcast discovery, Matthew?
Yeah, so the question, how does sound quality affect your decision to keep listening? So I'm fine with good enough audio if the content is great. That was 63%, whereas 37% said that they preferred the sound quality to be similar to a pro radio show, NPR, BBC. On hindsight, I'm not super happy with this question, because I think you could argue both. I think you would always rather it was good audio, but you're fine with it not being. So I'm not totally happy with this question, but still, it shows that a lot of folks are prepared to, to not have brilliant audio if the content's really good.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you're right. There'd be something around, would you stop listening to a show if it was less than, broadcast quality?
Mm-hmm.
Or would you not listen to a show because it was only average? Like, yeah, I'm not sure. We could improve that for next year, but I totally agree. I think it's good enough. The question is good enough to show that, a very big chunk of people are fine with good enough audio. So yeah, that's cool. I'll jump in now with our little sponsor slot as well. Going on audio quality, if you do want to improve your audio quality, of course, check out our podcast maker app, Alitu. It's designed to help you create the best audio quality you possibly can in the minimum possible effort. It's got audio cleanup, which does your levels, noise reduction, auto EQ for your voice. All of that is AI driven, really makes you sound amazing. And Matthew showed a sample a while back where he was recording at an event, the podcast show down in London, actually, with the great Sam Sethi, and an ambulance went past in the background, and we put it through the audio cleanup, and the ambulance literally disappeared. So it's really cool what AI can do to audio these days. Really good quality. So yeah, if you want your audio quality to be amazing, but also have audio editing tools suited just for podcasters, both text-based editing and the waveform, plus audio podcast hosting built in as well as your call recording. So call recording and solo recording built in. That's all over at Alitu. So Alitu is your all-in-one podcast maker app. Go and check it out at alitu.com. That's alitu.com. 7-day free trial to give it a shot and see if it suits you. All right. That was audio quality then. What about adverts, Matthew? Do adverts affect podcast discovery?
No, is the comprehensive answer. Yeah, 92% of people tolerate ads, podcast ads within reason. 5% won't listen to a show with adverts, whereas 3% enjoy listening to relevant ads. Does this surprise you in any way?
Nah, it's just always been the case, hasn't it? I mean, I think it's the same for most media. Like, how many things that you consume don't include an ad of some sort? And I think the data has shown over the years, and it still shows now, that podcast advertising is actually mostly the best because it's usually really contextual. I think it's because us as hosts, we can't get away with like a total nonsense ad that we don't really believe in because we've got to read it in our own voice generally. So like podcast host read ads are actually generally quite good because we have to talk about why this person's sponsoring our show, what we like about them. We have to give some justification. And all of that goes towards actually podcasters being a bit more discerning about who they get to advertise. The only difference being those inserted adverts, Matthew, where it's like cuts you off half sentence and you don't really get any control. But it's a less common way of sponsoring, I would suggest.
Aye. No, I think almost all listeners are reasonable enough to understand it. Just because the content, they're getting it for free, it's not free to create it. The listeners taking the podcasters taking their time, their expertise, their money and everything to put these things together, and they've got to recoup it somehow. So
yeah. Cool. All right. And that's it. That's the data, isn't it? Any big takeaways you want to bring out of this, Matthew, or have we kind of gone through it as we've spoken through the data?
Yeah, I think it's worth. I mean, we've covered some of this already, and obviously, on hindsight, I think the back catalogue one is maybe the one that I would have spotlighted had I written this report today. But one of the first of the three key takeaways that I've listed here, the first being discovery is in the hands of the podcaster. So this is really about, as much as we could always pick holes in podcast discovery, you could look at it one of two ways. Like, you could wait for somebody to come along and solve it with some new app or algorithm or that, or you could just take it into your own hands. Like, there's a lot you could do with your own podcast to make it more discoverable. Yeah. And folks who are complaining about the lack of visibility for their own show, that there's almost always more they could be doing, whether it's with their website, their episode titles, stuff we've been through in this episode. So just know that you're largely in control of this stuff, so don't feel disempowered about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think if there's anything I took from this, it's your description, that forgotten part of your episodes, of your podcast itself. Go and see if you need to update your description, see if you can make it better. Think about the name and the artwork as well. I mean, that is how people find it in the first place, that SEO side of things. Like, people are searching in the podcast app, they're searching by topic. They're showing that in the data here. So that name makes such a difference to being found. And then the artwork really draws them in by, reiterating the name, reiterating the purpose of that podcast too. But yeah, that's definitely a big part to go back and check out again. And I think there's something about you've written a really good comment here about long form content. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, again, it ties into what we were saying earlier and what we'll be saying in a wee while as well. But yeah, like, we've been writing about this a lot, as of other good folks in the industry, that long form content, this is a great medium to create it. It's not the only medium to create it in, but yeah, we're seeing evidence, we're seeing hard data that people like to spend a bit of time with a topic and get really into the nuances of it. So yeah, definitely never feel pressured into, going really short, unless that's as long as it takes to get to your content and get it all sort of resolved, if you like.
Yep, agreed. Cool. All right. Well, let's dig into a couple of should we just do a quick mention of a couple of the articles here? We've got the Movo iVlogger that I mentioned earlier. Go and check this out if you are creating video content for your podcast, whether it's a video podcast. Maybe a solo one would work really nicely for this. It's essentially a tripod that you can mount your smartphone to. So the smartphone goes onto the tripod, but above that, you can put on, well, actually, it comes with it, doesn't it, Matthew? It comes with a shotgun mic and a spotlight as well. So it's essentially an all-in-one video studio for your smartphone. So it really easily let you record solo episodes really nicely, segments for a video channel that you're doing. But equally, I mean, can you record? You can record on mobile with call recording platforms these days a bit as well, can't you? So you could potentially use this to record with something like, Riverside, Squadcast, StreamYard, all of those kind of platforms too. We'd have to test how they work nicely with smartphones, but potentially works there too.
Yeah, no, I really like this. I mean, there are wee issues with various bits and pieces that I've talked about in the review, like the shock mount was really stiff to get the mic in. And again, I talked about lighting, my battles with the light, and I think that's more down to my own inexperience, and I'm horribly colourblind as well, but I really like this wee bit of kit. So I'd encourage a listener to check it out if they're in the market for something like that. And Movo, they seem like a really good company. I've actually just started this morning testing their podcasting kit. Mm-hmm. So, and this looks great. So I'm really excited to dig into that as well. So Movo, a company I'd heard about, but I'd never had a look at any of their gear firsthand until now. So really cool stuff.
Okay, perfect. The other article to check out as well. Should say all of the links to these articles are in the show notes if you want to go and check out the detail. But we updated our best podcast directories article as well, mainly just to take into account the growth of YouTube as a directory for podcasts, how you can use that, what the best ways to use that are for podcasters, but also this death of a couple as well. So Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and now TuneIn as well being closed for submissions. So worth taking a look at that, making sure that, actually, there's not too much to do apart from you're not going to remove yourself from Google Podcasts or Stitcher, but certainly some tips around using YouTube as a directory in there as well.
Yeah, and just again, if you've got a subscribe or follow page on your website, just get those links tidied up. Like, you might have the old legacy Stitcher button or that. They don't need to be there anymore, and you probably don't want to be pointing folks to Google Podcasts as well. So
yeah, perfect. And then a mention for a couple of external articles before we get into this adapt or get left behind article that we've got here. The full disclosure, the power of unedited audio is just really worth noting and mentioning, because Blueberry have put this together. And it really ties into that post that Katie did recently on long form content. Matthew? It was in our episode. Was it last episode we talked about that?
Yeah, I think so. No, a couple of episodes ago. But this is on the Blueberry blog. Again, links in the show notes. But really good piece. This is, probably from an American perspective, and they've just gone through an election. And I think there has been a lot of just short clips here and there, no context. And this is just talking about, how good it is to hear somebody speaking about something in its entirety rather than just hearing, like I say, sound bites and that. So again, this all ties into what we've talked about today and what we've been talking about for a few months now. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And a final one from John McDermott. Do we need to kill off the word podcast? Again, Matthew, once more per year.
Yeah.
Although you said it's kind of a jokey one though, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it was actually, this is a funny, well-written article, and I don't actually think that's what he's suggesting. There's a bit of gentle clickbait there, but I enjoyed that. He seems like a really good writer, really funny guy, so we'll put a link to that one in the show notes too.
Cool. It's seeing the title though is a total eye roll, isn't it? Because that was such a... It has died off in the last while, the last half decade maybe, but through the sort of 2010s, I found it came up all the time, didn't it? Like, this word podcast is rubbish. It's a terrible name. Can we kill it?
I think we'll see it more now that Spotify for podcasters has been changed to Spotify for creators. A lot of people are going to be saying, "Oh, that's the end." But you've got to remember, YouTube have literally just got into like, here's podcasts and that. Yeah. So it's like people often cherry pick what they want to hear with their agendas on that. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the biggest content platforms on the planet has literally just added that exact word, podcasts, to one of the most prominent places in the app. So don't think it's going anywhere. All right, let's get into this other topic then. So we've got this article here from Max Cutler, he's the founder of Pave Studios. He's also the head of Talk Creator Content and partnerships at Spotify. So bear in mind, he's got a horse in this race, and that Spotify are really pushing that way. And quite a few of the claims in this article are about things that Spotify want to happen, essentially, or, well, claiming that they're predicting these things will happen, but it's more that's the way they're building. So they now want it to happen because they're putting their bet on that. The principle being that he's saying that podcasting is becoming a multi-platform medium and video is the future of podcasting. And a quote he's got in here is that traditional audio podcasts are on their way out. So, I mean, that's the claim. That's the big claim. So, Matthew, are audio podcasts on their way out in 5 years' time? Is every podcast going to be video? Audio podcasts will not exist?
Yeah, I mean, we've not always heard about the video podcasting thing, but ever since I got into podcasting, there's always been somebody saying like a big change is coming, or podcasting's going to die, or that. So this is nothing new, but it's there's a lot to kind of unpack here, isn't there? Just for nothing else, people will read stuff like this and maybe get disillusioned or caught up in it. So I think it's nice to offer an alternative opinion.
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think Matthew or I believe in this at all. And he's obviously an accomplished guy. I'm sure there are some great points in here. Like, I think a lot of podcasts will go multi-channel. It's a real benefit to a podcast if you can do all of that stuff. But it's just not, I think it's just a wrong claim altogether to say that audio-only podcasts are on the way out. And he even brings in like just kind of some slightly crazy claims, as in, he says, the saturated market of podcasts. Like, how can you possibly succeed in this saturated market of 600,000 podcasts? And then you go over to YouTube and say, all right, fair enough. So if saturated means 600K, how many YouTube channels are there, I wonder? Can you guess, Matthew?
Many tens of millions.
113 million.
There you go.
Yeah. So, I mean, I to be fair, I have not fact checked this. I did a bit of searching, and this was a number that came up in more than one place. 113 million active YouTube channels compared to 600,000 podcasts. So, I mean, saturated? Like, that's a crazy claim. Anyway, right, go. You've got a few thoughts jotted down here, Matthew. What do you want to dig into first?
Yeah. So Max heavily points to a small elite core of people, your Joe Rogans, etc., as examples of this. And I think that's very skewed. Like, we know we've talked about this a lot, Colin. All video isn't equal. And you could look at Rogan getting somebody into his studio and that, and it's like a TV show.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of shows like this. But you and I getting together on like say Riverside or Squadcast and both recording at our ends, that you can't say that our video there would be the same as, somebody getting someone in the studio and they've got multi-camera. It's a totally different thing. So you can't just talk about video. It's not just one thing. And this stat that I see a lot about, like 60% of consumption being YouTube and Spotify, I think that will be skewed as well, because like the top 0.5% of shows there will bring a lot of those numbers. Like one Joe Rogan video, again, I keep referencing Rogan, but he is such a, he is such a well-watched podcaster, regardless of your opinion of him. Yeah. So I think data like that is skewed as well. Like these aren't the same things. Yeah. So
there's this like kind of self-fulfilling cycle whereby podcasts almost always start out audio only. Maybe you do record a bit of the video, maybe you do some clipping, but it's like low quality video. The audio really drives it because that's what kind of draws people in. Maybe you grow it a bit through the clips, that kind of stuff. But these shows, like Rogan's show, started audio only, and it started to succeed because it was a great audio only show for a certain group of people. And therefore, once it starts to do well, they get sponsorship money in, and then suddenly it's worthwhile spending more on the video. You make that better. And then suddenly it becomes, at a certain point, it becomes no longer just a podcast, it's a TV show, which is part of the point that Max is making, which is completely true. But it's such a small percentage of shows actually get to that stage and graduate to being something different, to being a TV show, essentially. Like that's what Rogan is these days. It's what a few of the biggest podcasts have become because they've built themselves a studio and they've built themselves a massive team that costs more money than just about any like normal audio only podcast could sustain. And so it's like, it just makes them into something else. I just don't think that changes what audio podcasts are. It doesn't make them disappear. It doesn't, I think it just means that there's actually more of an audience for conversational content that looks like a podcast, whereas the audio only version still stays there, still growing actually, just it doesn't grow as fast. His other claim in it was that podcast listening, like audio only listening, has slowed, like the growth has slowed. And that's actual nonsense as well. Like the Edison data shows that it's been up and down a little bit, but it's had a steady increase over the last 10 years. There was one jump between about 18 and 19 where it was about 7% growth. But every other year it's been between 3 and 5%. And last year it was 4% growth. Sorry, 3% growth last year, 3% growth the year before, 5% growth the year before that. So, I mean, I suppose technically 3 from 5 is a slight decline, but there was like 3% growth 10 years ago, 15 years ago too. So it's like slow, steady growth it's always been with audio podcasts. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's just I think you're absolutely right. It's a selection bias for those very, very top shows, those top 0.01% that graduate to turning it into a proper TV show. That is just makes it a different thing. And then suddenly you think, well, all podcasts have to go that way because this one's been so successful. But it's absolute nonsense. It's just not true because so many audio podcasts still do really well just being audio. And some people taking a stand, like the Tim Ferriss show is a comparator, isn't it? Like a really big interview show. And he's said quite a few times he doesn't want to do video because actually it would just make his life more complicated. It would cost a lot more money. It might make a bit more money, but his existing podcast makes millions as it is. So it's going to stay audio only. So yeah, I don't know.
It's also like, it's not this, again, binary thing of like, I'm an audio only podcaster or I've basically got a TV show. Like there is a middle ground there and you could do your audio for years and then maybe you will do the odd thing on YouTube. You know, maybe you do have a particular social media platform that you like to post the odd like shorts or whatever on. So you could dabble in that stuff. It's not just like you have to dive into it. You know, I'm doing it, everything. I think to tell people it's their job now to do all this, it's just going to leave a lot of people I mean, it literally says you'll be left behind if you don't adapt. And I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's a good message to put out.
No, it's an awful message. It's an awful message. It'll be killing. I've said this. I put out a video a little while back. It got one of the biggest responses I've got to anything I put back in recent years around, I think that video is killing podcasts, not because podcasts need to be video, but because it's creating this expectation that podcasts need to be video. And therefore people are either starting a podcast and trying to do video alongside it as a solo team and dying because they just can't do it. You can't do it all. Or they're just not starting because they think, I just can't do video, so it's too difficult. Whereas there's all these shows would start when it's just you speaking into a mic, so much less work on editing, so much less work in gear and all that kind of stuff. And so it's damaging. Yeah, it's a really damaging message. And I think it just... even if part of it's true, as in the commercial side of podcasting moves much more towards video, what's wrong with the hundreds of thousands of hobby podcasts out there that have 100 listeners that people just love to listen to? Some of your favorite shows can just have a few hundred listeners, and somebody that doesn't earn that much money from it is audio only. It's a great listen. You listen to it while walking the dog. That kind of thing will die off because of messages like this, and that's a real shame.
I also think, I've heard for years the term, and it's a noble sentiment, but, meeting audiences where you are, it sounds a very good thing to say, but it comes as a cost at a certain point. For podcasts, we have the RSS feed and we could push stuff out there without any extra effort. But if you're really going into platforms where, you need to log in and you need to create specific content for that, again, you meet the audiences where they are, but that like I say, it comes at a cost. It's like, if I'm earning a full-time income with a store on Etsy, I could get a shop on the high street or at the shopping centre and I would meet the audience where they are there, but I could bankrupt myself. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So it's all about sustainability, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. It's about sustainability and the fact that just video just doesn't add a lot of, you can go to the effort of adding video to a podcast, but what does it really add in many cases? So many people are listening to these video first shows in the background, opening up YouTube and then minimizing the window and listening to it, or just putting it in the background somehow, or it's Spotify playing in your pocket kind of thing. It's a bit crazy. So I can see it in some cases, some shows are making the effort. So part of the reason the Rogan show, I think, works on video is because he has a producer that actually brings in video feeds, and there are things that they show on the show to demonstrate what they're talking about, things like that. But most video shows don't do that at all, and most people don't have a producer that they can bring in for that. So, yeah.
And again, if you purely do audio, you could be on Spotify, obviously, and you can be on YouTube too, with your audio-only podcast. And a lot of folks, like we've said before, oftentimes, they say they're watching podcasts on YouTube, but they've got them on and they're listening to them. Yeah. So you could have your content on there anyway. Yeah. So just do that. I
think it'll change so much in the next 3-5 years as well anyway, because I was thinking this the other day, Matthew, our show, Hostile Worlds, was an old, it's 5 years old now, but it's as evergreen as it ever was. It's as relevant now as it ever was. We could re-release that now, and we could use AI to create animations, just cartoon illustrations, so graphics that demonstrate the stuff we're talking about on that show, all about space exploration, education around space and stuff like that. So in the near future, you could quite easily just get an AI to create some kind of visual complement to it, which is probably going to be even more interesting than just watching two faces yap at each other. If it's things that actually illustrate the things you're talking about, then maybe that's going to be even more relevant. So I don't know, maybe it'll become a bit of a moot point, because actually the video component of it will be somebody creating something that actually makes the audio a little bit better by demonstrating things, by illustrating things. I'm not sure, but anything else you think worth commenting on?
No, I think I've really said all I need to say. I hope nobody's discouraged by this, and that the main thing is you keep things sustainable, because if you stop doing it, that's it done. Yeah. It's finished. Yeah. So don't bite off more than you can chew. By all means, add these things in when you feel like you can. Yeah. But don't rush to do it.
I think there's even just the simple final point is how would audio podcasting die away, as he's suggesting, when one of the biggest, we see it in the data all the time, one of the biggest consumption methods for audio podcasting, for podcasting in general, is in the car. Driving in the car, it's in the background. Close to that is going to the gym or walking the dog or doing chores, things like that. Like that is a big part of the power of podcasting, is it's always been something that is akin to radio, not TV, because it's something that you can have on in the background while you're doing other rote tasks. So I think it's just quite... again, he has a horse in this race. There's reasons that they're putting out this argument. So maybe we shouldn't even be getting so worked up about it. It's like getting worked up at some marketing message, basically, which is what it is.
Yeah. Shouting at a cloud.
Yeah. But I think the trouble is exactly what you're saying there, Matthew. It's just damaging. It's like it'll stop people doing it. It'll put people off. It'll make them despondent about it. It'll kill actual podcasts that could have done well otherwise without it. So I think that's why we get wound up, isn't it?
Topically, Pod News went out this afternoon, and I was just quickly reading it. And there's a great article. I don't know if this is possibly a reply to Max's post. It was by Neil Veglio. Sorry if I'm getting your name wrong, Neil. But the hidden risks of YouTube and Spotify. This is a good wee caution. Really against people who seem so keen for their stuff to be owned by YouTube and Spotify. So this is another nice alternative take to that post. Yeah. So I'll link to that as well. Lots for the listener to go and read after this. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the fact that it's putting all your eggs in one basket, isn't it? Putting all your content on YouTube. And I'm not saying don't. I mean, it's no doubt a great discovery platform. We put a lot of our content on YouTube as well, but it's just not the be-all and end-all, essentially.
No.
All right. Will that do it for this episode?
Yeah, it surely will. Thanks for sticking with us. I've enjoyed the discussion today, especially going through all that data as well.
I really think there was so much like really good stuff. Like, there's some of it is kind of like, oh yeah, that's kind of what I thought, my gut feeling, but it's great to see some data that backs it up. And others is actual little surprises that are like, oh yeah, I do need to go back and check in on my description or like do other stuff just based on this. So yeah, really good to see that. So yeah, good work getting out there, Matthew, and putting it all together, because I know it wasn't a small job. All right. Thank you out for listening as well. Hope you got something out of this. Again, please do check out our podcast maker app, Alitu, if you're looking for something to make your show and create it in a much easier way. You can record in there, call recording. After all this discussion, we're adding video recording in there quite soon as well. So you'll be able to record your video. That's now apparently essential, but not really. You can actually just record audio as well, of course. You can edit in there, hosting and audio cleanup too. So go over to alitu.com, that's alitu.com, to check that out. Otherwise, enjoy your week in podcasting, and we'll speak to you next time. Talk to you then.